morning from London. It's almost the afternoon. It's a cold and grey morning. It's dribbling away. It's very wet, but fortunately it's not snowing. So good morning from here, or good afternoon, good evening to whichever part of the country or the world you are. Welcome to Zaidi International Virtual University, another webinar on a subject of philosophical magnitude. It is my passion. It's been for a long, long time. Ethics has been my almost part and parcel of my thinking process for the last 25, 30, or maybe 40 years. And I have written extensively on various aspects of ethics, but meta-ethics is something new which came up recently into my horizon as I was discussing the subject with my grandson, who was a student in Imperial Science College and very good at philosophy. And we were talking about it. And one day he said that, what is the meaning of truth? Or what is the meaning of good? And we started talking about it. And I said the answer would be that we discuss it and write it, and then, of course, discuss it with the experts like yourself. So welcome to this seminar or webinar. It should be dedicated to the subject of meta-ethics of pan-COVID era. The reason I'm using the word pan is that COVID is not over yet. It started in 2020, as we all know, but it's been going on and on and on. We have to learn to live with it. So I think the answer is that what we have to do is we have to adapt and accept it as a reality, almost like malaria, almost like flu, almost like TB in developing countries, and many other conditions. So the reason for using that terminology, pan-COVID, is obvious that now we are dealing with it. We're living in the world of COVID. Could I ask you, Moshe, to kindly change my slides, because I'm sharing, I can't share, I can try, but I think it's better. Okay, so the learning objectives of this particular webinar are as follows: to teach health professionals to recognize the humanistic and meta-ethical aspects of healthcare, to enable health professionals to examine and develop their own personal and professional moral commitments, to equip health professionals with a foundation of philosophical, social, and moral knowledge. Next. And to enable health professionals to employ this knowledge in clinical reasoning, because if we cannot use knowledge in applied medical sciences, then it's a waste of time. The whole objective of the exercise for me and my colleagues who've been doing earlier on, you heard Dr. Fatima Jawad talk about ethics of publications. Unless you apply in clinical science, your practice, whether you're a clinician or non-clinical health professional, the objective will not be served. So one of the essential things is that you should apply in day-to-day life. Also, to equip them with the interactional skills needed to apply this insight, knowledge, and reasoning to human clinical care. Now, the reason I've used this word human clinical care is that there is a difference between what is called normative ethics, and I'll discuss briefly, and what is called applied clinical ethics, that is applied to human care, particularly care regarding the involvement of patients with COVID and age-related diseases. I'll discuss that briefly. Next, please. Ethics, of course, everybody knows that ethics is important in life. In every aspect, every field of life, ethics is important. This is a famous quote from a French existentialist who says that a man without ethics is like a wild beast. And this is English, which is French English, loosed upon this world. I would have thought it should be loosened upon this world. Anyway, that's not my language. But what it means is ethics is important. If you do not have ethics, you're like wild beast. Next, please. Immanuel Kant is very well known throughout the world of philosophers and thinkers and ethicists. He's the one who actually brought in the concept of duty and reasoning. And he says that act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, and that is important, never really as a means to end, but always at the same time as an end. That means you use the objective of the whole exercise in duty-based reasoning and clinical ethics is that the means and the ends should both be good. Next, please. Metaethics is a branch of philosophy, and philosophy, of course, is moral philosophy and illogical philosophy. There are different aspects of philosophy, but it's basically a branch of moral philosophy. It explores the status, foundation, and scope of moral values, properties, and words. It's not really looking at the applied sciences, but it's looking slightly higher level as to what is the word, what is the meaning of that particular, what is the meaning of word like good or truth or honesty or justice. So it is slightly higher level than applied ethics and normative ethics. Next, please. Now, before I go and talk about metaethics, let me tell you that physics and metaphysics, they are two parallel things. Physics, the body. Metaphysics is the soul. Rose is a flower. The fragrance is its metaphysics. Air is metaphysical, for example. What you breathe in is metaphysical. The constitution, the body structure, the world, the sand, the clay, the mountains, everything is physical. So metaphysical is beyond the physical aspect. It's slightly outside the domains. That is why when you discuss metaethical aspects, you have to be more philosophical and applied sciences in clinical practice in day-to-day lives. Next, please. Major metaethical theories are numerous. They call it naturalism or non-naturalism, emotivism. I'll just briefly talk about emotivism. That is what concerns us in terms of good and bad. And there are other different things. Naturalists have got their own values. People have their cognitive and moral claims and different aspects, the applied sciences which are there, and theoretical sciences. Metaethics is theoretical. It's the foundation, the underlying principles as to what is honesty, what is good, like I said, what is ethics per se. So the theories beyond and above the normative principles is what's metaethics. Next, please. It explores moral values that originate what it means to say something is right or good, whether there are any objective moral facts, whether morality is culturally relative. I'd like to talk about that in a moment. There are two aspects. Is morality universal or is it relative to culture, norms, religion, faith, etc.? My belief is, and I think this is a belief of many scholars and who are more learned than I am, I'm only a humble student, that ethics is universal. Ethics is beyond our religions. Before the religions came into existence, as we know today, morality existed. Even the caveman had his own ethics of how to pray, how to live together, how to get married, how to have various interactions with the society. So ethics has been there for a long time. Morality is, according to some people, culture dependent. We'll discuss that in a moment. Next, please. Normative ethics is the basic principles which tell us what is good and bad and how to apply them in day-to-day practice. Of course, we know what is good and bad, but when you talk about normative principles, you're talking about certain traits in the character in a person, following the right path or the wrong path, doing a good act or bad act, doing things properly, like clinically applying sciences for the welfare of mankind or for the evil purposes. And we just heard from Dr. Fatima about the famous experimental work that was done by Nazis on the prisoners of war in the Nazi era. That was the ultimate form of evil act. Next, please. Now, there are two differences. This gentleman called Durham, they have written a wonderful article. I've given the reference somewhere later on. It highlights the difference between the clinical ethics that we apply in day-to-day life, such as deontological principles based on duty and honesty and reasoning and other facts, and public health ethics, which is controlled and governed by the hierarchy, by the like WHO, like the states, the governments, ministers, etc. And public health ethics is the domain of the public in general, civic society. Clinical ethics, as applied to today, is within the domain of health professionals, as we do. Of course, we are part of the public healthcare systems. And therefore, what is important is that we have to differentiate clinical ethics and public health ethics. And how do we try and achieve the greatest good for the whole population? And I'll talk briefly about utilitarianism in a moment. Next, please. Moral uncertainty is existent at the moment, particularly after the COVID invasion. We don't know what is good and what is bad. People have tried different aspects. Like here is an example that verifiable facts, such as whether a patient with COVID-19 pneumonia is likely to benefit from being put on a ventilator from normative uncertainty, or whether putting that person rather than some other person on a ventilator due to the shortage of equipment is morally right. This was practiced and seen during the early era of 2020, that there was one ventilator and two patients. How do you decide which patient deserves it more? Both have equal rights to life. Both have all the human dignity is equal. Everything's, how do you decide? That is where the parameters of moral uncertainty creep in. And we have to try and find out the parameters at what should be the determining factors to give the best chance of survival to the person who's suffering either way, with COVID or without COVID. Next, please. What we saw that pan-COVID era, and even today, we see that goodness is lacking somehow. Authorities have failed to do good on time. They have done towards the end, but not on time. The civic society, however, and philanthropic organizations have shown a lot of mercy, philanthropy, and care, and they have applied the principle of goodness. But have the governments done that? Have the authorities done that? That is a question that I'll ask you. Next, please. Then there is a question of, which we saw during the early part of COVID, that the needs were more than the supplies. We saw that in the case of PPEs. For the initial 2-3 months, there were no PPEs. I mean, a lot of my friends, at least 3 of my colleagues, my college mates, died in the early part, in January and February of 2020, because PPEs, nobody knew what to do. Supplies were short, there was no planning, nobody advised what to do, nobody knew what was happening. So there was a failure on the part of authorities, and they felt incompetent or incapable to match with the needs of the people. Next, please. This is the objective. We want to follow this principle, and generally we try to follow it. Rawls' social contract theory is a wonderful theory. All individuals in a society should have fair quality of opportunities and an equal chance as everybody else of similar nature and ability. So the level playing field should be given. Able-bodied should compete with the able-bodied and disabled with disabled. But we saw that many times disabled persons, or people who with less facilities or less opportunities, were deprived of receiving the vaccines or medication or hospitalization or admission to the hospital. Next, please. We should also remember that care of the disabled is a top priority thing. Globally, it is really, really important. That should be given top priority in your professions. Physical impairment alone is not a bodily impairment. You can have sensory disabilities, silent disabilities, deafness, blindness, mental incapability. So many varieties of disabilities are there. Have they received equal share of what they want? And remember, equity and equality are two different things. Equity is giving to one person what he wants, what he needs, not what he needs. Giving a person a thing that he needs, that is equity. Equality is giving everyone whatever is needed in that society. There is a subtle difference between the two things. Disabled people may not need or want something that the able people want, and vice versa. So that is social contract theory. The NHS basically in the UK works on the principle of social contract theory, but it has failed miserably, as we all know. Next, please. This was the other problem that we saw, and this is again a meta-ethical aspect. The resource allocation was not carried out. The utilitarian approach was that you try and maximize the benefits to a large number of people that will give service to the people, also popularity to the leaders, to the politicians that you're serving. They're serving the mankind to the best of their abilities, despite the lack of facilities. There was also the question of rationing. Was rationing decent or allowable factor? Was it a good element, good practice? And that is a question that you can discuss. I mean, with the world, which is flooded, especially the developed world, the rich countries, they're flooded with money. There's so much money. Still, there was a rationing of the ventilators, and people suffered because there was a lack of. There's a friend of mine who was a maxillofacial surgeon. He had to struggle to get onto a ventilator. Somebody I know in Pakistan who suffered, he actually succumbed because the ventilator was not available. He was a doctor whose family was taken to one hospital to the other, but because of the rationing of ventilators, he succumbed. Next, please. So there is a moral dilemma and moral distress and moral trauma that everybody felt. These are two persons who distinguish between moral dilemmas, being forced to make trade-off between one set of moral commitments, such as caring for the patients, and a competing set of commitments, such as protecting one's life. So if you're a doctor and you have to serve patient and community or family practice where the COVID patients, you have to safeguard your family as well. So there's a conflict there, moral dilemma starts there. How do you go to the patients and bring back, God forbid, COVID to your family? That was a moral dilemma a lot of people faced. And I know some people in my family were doctors. They literally lived in the basement area or in outer areas during the COVID era because they were scared they might bring COVID to the family. Then there is this concept of moral distress, which is slightly different, that is felt by the health professionals as they feel that they are not able to deliver the goodness they want to do in a given particular situation, either because of lack of facilities or lack of opportunities or lack of, perhaps sometimes lack of desire also. There were many people who decided that they would just take a time off or disappear or take retirement, early retirement, because they could not face such a situation. Next, please. Moral trauma. This is a favorite subject of mine. I have written it also and published it in one of the journals. It is a concept that which actually is drawn from the concept of psychological, biological, spiritual, behavior, and social impact following a war or combat or any kind of distress. But we saw this moral trauma not only in the patient in the physicians who were treating patients with COVID, also teachers, they could not teach properly, parents who could not take care of their children, families who could not take care of each other. So moral trauma was a major impact during the COVID era and continues to do so even now. Next, please. So when patients are judged to be dying within hours or days of presence of family or the presence of the family at their side for short visits, this was a very common problem. Patients were not allowed, the families were not allowed to see the dying patients. In the early part, I remember in London, many Muslim patients who died. There was pretty challenging even to bury them. The Maulana will be reluctant to go to bury, or somebody, the coffin bearer was reluctant to go there. And that was a major trauma. It was a trauma that I know in particular Maulana who talked to me only recently, that he can't forgive himself because he was scared that if he went there for burial, he'd catch COVID and bring it to the family. So that was a major, major problem. Next, please. This is a concept that some of the ethicists believe that the ethical theories and meta-ethical theories should be universal or relative to culture. Culture plays a very important role, goes without saying. For example, tattooing is common in the West, but is it that common in the Eastern countries? Probably not. Likewise, polygamy or monogamy and all the other factors, they are culture dependent, yes, but ethical values are universal. Truth will always remain truth. Honesty will always remain honesty. Goodness will always remain goodness, irrespective of cultural variation. But yes, culture plays an important part. And it's important that a physician or health professional should be culture sensitive. You cannot apply the formula that is used in the West and the East and vice versa. You have to be careful as to how to break the bad news, how to take care of the COVID patient, how to approach the patient in different situations, etc. So culture sensitivity is important, but culture relativism is not accepted. Next, please. Of course, everybody knows humanity suffered and continues to suffer, not just because of the coronavirus by itself, disease, but also the question of economic problems, the financial difficulties, loss of jobs, and all these factors that combine together to give rise to impact on human life, human dignity, rights and obligations. Everything has suffered in these things. What is going to happen in the future is something we cannot really foresee. But what is happening is that politicians have realized their mistakes, and things are beginning to flatten out, not improve, but flatten out. It is tough to convince the politicians, statesmen, and people in authority, but this is the job of the professionals, the civic society. They should point out the wrongs that were done or that are being carried out during the COVID pandemic and its management. Next, please. What is the role of bioethicists? Can you go forward? Yes. The bioethicists, like you and I, every doctor, every health professional, every nurse has a right to raise a voice. We have to be conscious about the data. The scientific data has to speak correctly, as Dr. Fatima Jawad was saying, that no plagiarism, no cooking of data. It should be honest, fair, and genuine data. And one has to be careful in dividing the false, the wrong things from the true and the genuine things. It's important that we take essential measures depending on the emergency and social care of the patient during normal circumstances and what is happening at the moment that we are suffering with the COVID after effects. Next, please. And that is a question that I ask my colleagues in medical colleges, medical schools, and universities. How important, how urgent is the fact that medical ethics should be introduced in the curriculum as a hard empirical studies. It is being introduced in different countries, like in the UK. Now it has become almost mandatory that one has to study ethics right through the 4-year program or 5-year program. In fact, some students take philosophy and ethics at A levels instead of taking zoology or botany or chemistry is mandatory, physics is not. So you can opt out. Now, can that happen in other countries also? That is the question I leave to the audience, some of whom are professional teachers in medical colleges and vice chancellors, etc. Next, please. The massive deaths of elderly people living in the hospice in Sweden, Spain, Italy, based on implicit fairness, has recently posed certain questions on the moral and acceptability of it. And that is a question that's coming up. This situation is happening in the UK as well, in China and numerous other countries, that patients have died, and many times elderly people have been allowed to die. They say peacefully died because they did not have the facilities, or I should not say it with tongue in my mouth, I'd say that they did not have the inclination to treat them. That is the question of morality. It should not happen. This is almost like euthanasia. Next, please. Truth-telling was in short supply. The purpose of truth-telling is not simply to enable patients to make informed choices about healthcare and other aspects of their lives, but also to inform them about their situation. Truth-telling fosters trust in the medical profession. It rests on the respect owed to patients as persons, as human beings. It also prevents harm, as patients who are uninformed about the situation may fail to get medical help. And there are various examples I can quote. Sometimes if a patient has a COVID and is developing severe pneumonia, he's about to die, he wants to write a will. He has to be told the truth. But who should tell the truth, and how do you tell the truth to somebody who's dying? There is the aspect of cultural relativity that comes in here. In the West, every patient is autonomous. You have to tell the patient himself. In the East, if you did this, you might precipitate the situation. So you have to use various forms. Autonomy should come first, or benevolence should come first. That is a question. But truth-telling is mandatory. Now, what is sometimes said is that withholding truth sometimes may be better than lying. Withholding truth is not the same as lying. Withholding truth means that you're trying to avoid bringing harm to the patient or the patient's family. Next, please. One major lesson we learned was the failure of governments, authorities in telling the truth. The data was sometimes cooked up. Is telling the truth not good? So here is a question. Is good not meaningful? And this is a metaphysical question, metaethical question. Is good not meaningful? Next, please. Is good not meaningful? Let us look at it from the point of view of philosophers who call themselves metaethicists. Central to metaethics is the debate between realism and anti-real. What is real and what is anti-real? What is good? What is bad? What is the definition of truth by itself? Next, please. So, there's a famous philosopher I'd encourage you to write about, read him, J.E. Moore. In his book called Principia Ethica, he argues that good is a non-definable entity, non-definable, non-tangible property. Like you say, it's white, this color is blue or green or red, it's spring or summer. These are things which are perceptions more than something that you can say in words, or it is something like comes from prior knowledge. that you have built into your system. So when you say yellow, what is yellow? Can you recognize it except for mental calculation, mental perception? So that's the way, that is how good is. Goodness is a sense of perception. It is a feeling from that comes from inside. It is a quality that develops into your system, which gives you what Plato described as eudaimonia, a description which is not like joy or happiness. It is something, if you do good, you feel that you're content with life, and that is called itminana qalb. That is what is goodness. Next, please. Next. These are the meta-ethical attributes that we should remember: honesty, truth, fairness, justice. Each one has a definition, and in a couple of my books, I've written in depth on what is honesty and what is truth and what is fairness and what is justice. Justice remains the fundamental pillar of all theories of ethics, irrespective of your belief. Next, please. This is what I just said, that we saw that many people who were elderly and they were suffering with severe COVID-19, they were allowed to die. They were allowed to die because they said if somebody else can be saved, should we use our resources for that? Is that justified? Is that justified in this modern world when so many facilities are available? But this happened. And this was the explanation that was given by these people, that life is probably not worth living under certain circumstances. Can it be justified morally? That is a debatable question. Next, please. So I feel, and this is my observation, and I think a lot of people agree with me. Dr. Yadullah Zarzadeh in Kurdistan, last time he was with me in one of the lectures, he also said the same things, that governments fail, states fail, world authorities fail, politicians fail to tell the truth. They were cooking up the data, they were hiding it because they feared that if you gave the real data, the panic will start and they will then lose their popularity and the government and the authority and what have you. Next, please. Then there's a question of services within limited resources. Why were the services limited? Why were the resources limited? The world is flooded with money. Look at the amount of money being wasted on these space programs and what have you. I will not label them. But the point is that there was so much money available and still there was shortage of ventilators, oxygen applied beds, and the supplies were inadequate, so much so that they tried to bring in from different countries, and still in the developing countries particularly, there was a acute shortage, as we all know. Next, please. Then there's a question of accountability. Everything should be audited. Accountability comprises of these factors: transparency, equity and equality, fair distribution, and application of rules and regulations. What the question is, were these questions, they were asked by press, media, and civic society, were they answered by the authorities? If not, then who's responsible for the damage that COVID has done? Next, please. Is there a hope that public empowerment will support robust global public engagement and meaningful deliberations, especially after discussions like this and after we've seen on televisions and media and whatever, that politicians have been cornered, but they have their own agenda, often personal, rarely national, and seldom global. And that is the observation that majority people have made. Next, please. Next. Is it possible that human rights bodies worldwide will acquire executive power? And how could this become possible? How influential the precautionary principle can become regarding clinical and research? So what is important is that civic societies, the public opinion generally should build up and hold certain people responsible for what has happened and what is still happening. COVID is not over, it's going to stay. And my friend David is going to talk next week on the new pandemic, which is waiting to come, that is Alzheimer's. So we have to prepare for the future pandemics. We have to learn from mistakes, learn from our past inappropriate measurements and inappropriate measures that we've taken in the past, and learn to apply for the future for the betterment of human society. Next, please. This is a question. Pandemics will attack the mankind again. Have we learned the lessons like early notification, recognition and warning, proper and orderly supplies of equipment? Next, please. What is the reason for failure? These are some of the aspects. Lack of reliable data. And Dr. Fatma discussed about data analysis and data collection. We've had this discussion during the course. How do you collect the reliable data? Then pardon me, there was a question of lack of trust in the politicians, health authorities, in the planners. There was no planning whatsoever. There was a lack of proper execution. People were taking examples from here and there, but there was no global policy. In Africa, things were miserable. In Asia, things were miserable. In UK and USA, everywhere things were miserable. So it's a lack of proper execution, lack of planning, lack of trust, lack of reliability. All these factors combined together to cause the catastrophe that we just been through and still going on. Next, please. Ethics transcends times and age. It has no limitations. Moral values are universal, as I just said. They're free of strictures, religion, faith, etc. They do not apply as such. Yes, religion and faith will modify it according to norms and principles of a given faith, but the principle will always remain the same. They always remain the same across the ages and times. Next, please. And this is where I bring the question of when should you teach ethics? Ethics begins at home. It need not be taught per se. It is a basic etiquette and mannerism that you learn from at your mother's feet, at your mother's knee, and you start learning from your father, your elders. Hidden curriculum is an essential part of medical education. You learn from mentors, you learn from your seniors, from the civic society, from your religious organizations. Ethics does not have to be religious, but it has to be universal, and principles of human dignity and rights and observation of certain values have to be above and beyond the beliefs, beyond the cultural norm, beyond the limitation that we've created artificially. Next, please. So, like I said earlier, morality is not relative, it is universal. However, what is important that culture should be embedded in ethics, and you have to learn the cultural aspects and nuances of different cultures where you work in practice. Teaching universal principles of ethics must also incorporate a study of cultural values. And I keep saying it, I've written extensively on cultural anthropology, that you have to know the culture in which you're practicing. If you can, and that is what we were discussing yesterday with Suchita in one of the lectures, that the curriculum has to be contextual. It should be dependent on the society in which you're living. If you try and teach something which is alien to the society which you're serving, it's meaningless. And that is why I insist that cultural anthropology should be a subject that should be taught in the subject of curriculum during the medical education, undergraduate or postgraduate levels. Next, please. Next. Can you move it? Yes. So teaching ethics transcends age, time, space due to local values should be important. Norms and practice which is universal, they should be imbibed. Adult learning approach, andragogy, is the best way to learn from your elders. When you grow up, start from early age and continue to learn. Learn from your elders, follow this. This is called a perception through osmosis. You observe something from your elders, you absorb it. Through an osmotic process, it imbibes into your system. That was the system of medical education, that apprenticeship was a standard modality. The guru and the chela lived together for years and years. And that's how the technology, the mannerism, the etiquette, and everything was automatically, imperceptibly transferred to the second generation. That is the best way to learn ethics and teach ethics. Next, please. What is important in clinical work is that prioritization should be, if you have X number of patients, you should know who should be prioritized. It's important not only because of efficiency and quality of care, but also from the ethical perspective. You should be honest and accountable. Allocation of life-saving ventricle, when so many are guests, how do you decide that? Distribution of resources. These are the sensitive matters. Nobody can teach you. You have to learn from your own system. Morality should be embedded in your system. I'll talk briefly about virtuous. If it's in your system, then you'll not have to think on a certain occasion, on a particular moment. It should come automatically, naturally, instinctively, that this is the situation, I must do this because that's the correct thing to do. Next, please. This is what's my favorite, virtue ethics. This is the most ancient doctrine introduced by all divine scriptures, prophets, and saints. Plato and Aristotle actually started. It's been revived after 1,000 years of lying under the snow or in the mountain, the glaciers, or hidden away somewhere. McIntyre revived it recently by a famous book, which is called After Virtue. And of course, my favorite writer, and I would strongly urge you to read, Pellegrino, who was a physician ethicist. He said that instead of teaching subjects that he was teaching these days in medical school, prior to medical, you ought to be teaching humanities, philosophy, ethics, because they are more practical, more applicable in your clinical health and clinical sciences and your life as a professional. Next, please. This is one philosophy which is very common. It was used in Italy during the early COVID era, that consequential means that the consequences of a certain action can justify the means. So means and ends may not be equally good. Deontology, where you have to have the ends and the means should both be good. In consequentialism, it's also called utilitarianism. If the outcome is good, then means can be justified even if they're wrong. For example, you catch a robber or you kill a dacoit, for example. That killing, the act of killing may be wrong, but you can justify it because you saved the mankind or the community and the people from an evil act that he was continuing to do it. That is consequentialism, and that was applied in some countries during the early COVID era. Next, please. Virtue ethics, which is my favorite, has 4 cardinal rules: courage, compassion, prudence, and justice. And when you combine them together and you apply in your daily life, you end up what's called practical wisdom. And when you apply practical wisdom in your day-to-day healthcare, that leads to a state called eudaimonia. That eudaimonia is not joy, it's not happiness, it's not satisfaction, it is not fulfillment of commitment, it is contentment of your heart. And that is a meta-ethical value of ethics: perception, quality of life, understanding, feeling good. That is eudaimonia. Next, please. Virtue ethics is indeed a superior approach to moral reasoning than pursuit, then say the purest utilitarianism, virtue, etc. These are different theories. I'll just go through the last few slides quickly. Next, please. Is doing good not good enough? That was a question that one has to ask. And I'll just quote here. Emotivists feel that doing good is an emotive experience as it provides a sense of achievement. So what they're saying is that some people think that good is not good enough. Only people who are emotional, like me, like majority of people, feel good. You do a good thing, you feel good. So that sense of perception, David Hume is a great philosopher. If you can read about emotivism, you'll enjoy reading him. That says that it's an emotive experience. Doing good gives you a feeling of pleasure, eudaimonia. That is why doing good is good. Next, please. Now I'll just give you an example of metaethics as applied in the question of vaccines. Now, vaccines have created a lot of confusion, but remember, vaccines have saved millions of lives. And yet there are people who are against vaccines. Even yesterday, I was listening to a radio, and they were talking about the side effects of vaccines. People still do not believe that vaccines have worked. There are people, role models in sports, without naming anybody, or people in professions, they're role models. Talk about only yesterday or this morning, I heard on TV, there was a famous doctor who was against it. And they were saying all kinds of things. This is ridiculous. So metaethics of vaccine, I've taken a sample from a PhD thesis, a beautiful article drawn out of a PhD thesis that came across when I was doing literature search for this talk. Next, please. I'll just give the example. Classical deontology is the Kantian form. It's a moral theory which claims that you differentiate between the moral goodness, rightness, or wrongness of an action of C determined by their consequences, but rather it is derived from the actions that you take. You do an action to do good, you work to save a patient's life, and you feel good. And that goodness gives you eudaimonia, and that gives you a metaphysical, metaethical feeling of serving mankind above and beyond sometimes your capabilities and your limitations. That is the objective of a good physician. Next, please. Virtue-based deontological approach is probably the best answer Virtue-driven deontological, that is care-based, gives it's a realm of bioethics and public health policy, which gives you that you develop an inherent capacity and more like an adat, a habit or second habit, that you, the moment you see something bad happening, you try and stop it. The moment you see that you can do something good, you do it without thinking twice. And that is a virtue you develop. And you do it not on the basis of because you're duty, because you're a physician, but also because you're a good human being. That is the objective of virtue-driven deontological ethics, which can be used in the distribution of vaccines. Next, please. So here's an example. There is a fact. But this was an experiment that was done by this gentleman whose thesis I'm using as a quote, a paper published out of that thesis. Vaccine A is a live attenuated vaccine and can be manufactured quickly and affordably. Vaccine B, on the other hand, costs twice as much and takes longer to manufacture. How do you decide it? Live, we know that from the fact. Live attenuated vaccines are contraindicated for most immunocompromised patients. So you've got two samples, vaccine A and vaccine B. How do you decide which should be used? Next, please. Now, what has happened in the health services, particularly in the UK, is, and also in US and other countries, that gatekeepers have come up. They're economists, they're financial experts. Oh, they get millions of pounds for their salaries, in terms of their salaries and benefits. They decide, they tell us what to do. They come and advise based on the economic factors. So the economic advisor here, he argues that the funds should be allocated to vaccine A, since it will save the most lives in the shortest amount of time and have the lowest detrimental impact on our post-lockdown economy, even though he knows it's not as good as the other, but because it'll save the impact of post-lockdown economy, he recommends that vaccine A should be used. Next, please. The economic advisor is a strong argument, but his utilitarian approach justifies sacrificing the life and well-being of millions of immunocompromised patients for the sake of maximizing the benefit of healthcare and chance of survival for the majority of population, so that the lockdown economy, they could save the economy from melting down and save the politicians of the states and the governments from collapsing. This is a typical example where people from outside the health profession, they come and advise us. Is it ethical? That is the question. Next, please. So the third alternative could be the 70%. This is the alternative this candidate has given in his thesis, and this thesis is beautiful, worth reading. It's a beautiful thing. That what you can do is that 70% of the funding can be allocated to vaccine A and 30% to be vaccine B. This approach serves the majority of population, that means using the formula of utilitarianism, without sacrificing immunocompromised individuals who are at a high risk of experiencing severe COVID-19 symptoms. This is the answer, or the solution to the dilemma that this particular person. You may not agree with it, but that is the example I'm giving you. The vaccines have created a huge dilemma. Vaccines came, and majority of countries in the developed world, they got straight away. First shot was given in the first one after. Many African countries and Asian countries did not get the first shot for several months afterwards. How do you decide, and who should determine these parameters? Who should get the vaccines first, who should not get it? And how do you decide what parameters should you use in terms of distribution of vaccine to which patients? Next, please. So the argument continues. A deontologist want to ensure that lives and health of both immunocompromised and non-immunocompromised individuals are valued just as much as you do the population as a whole. This is deontology. Utilitarianism, that fund controller or the gatekeeper said, no, you should use vaccine A because it's quick to make and you can maximize the benefit to a large number of population. Therefore, people can go back to work and the economy will not melt down. Next, please. Virtue-driven deontological approach will be to choose the right vaccine to control and hopefully eradicate COVID-19. It's the most holistic and personhood valuing moral theory that can address and prevent the harms. This is the suggestion, this is the proposal, this is the take-home message that this particular thesis is given, and it appeals to my common sense, that the whole approach in vaccination process should be virtue-based. You do a good thing because it's a good thing. You want to do a good thing because it gives you happiness, eudaimonia, and you feel that you're doing service to the mankind above and beyond the call of duty. And that is what's called virtue ethics. Next, please. This recognize the lives of human comrades. This, of course, I'll just repeat it. I don't want to repeat it for the sake of time. Next, please. And then finally, a few things about teaching ethics. I feel very strongly that ethics should be taught properly. The times have gone that should be hidden curriculum. No, no more. Ethics, knowledge expanded exponentially. So you should learn ethics, should apply ethics, learn it from practical examples, clinical sciences, from scenarios that you see in day-to-day life. Teach ethics to your students as a part of medical education curriculum. It is not good enough to say that you learn from home or learn from practical experience. No, you should teach the fundamental. You should know the normative principles first. Next, please. The important flaw, because we were living and following the Western philosophy and Western medical practice, so I would strongly urge you all to read some of these philosophers that I've chosen from a little bit of study that I do of philosophy all the time, the Western philosophy, from Epicurean to Stoics, Descartes. Descartes was very famous, one of the greatest. You should read Descartes, Hobbes, Hume, Bergson, all great. Kant, you cannot go in ethics without reading Kant. Immanuel Kant is the watershed in the philosophy. And then, of course, Stuart Mills, who came later, he came up with his Stuart Mill and Bentham. They came with the concept of utilitarianism. You should read them all. Whenever you have some time at leisure, don't read other things. Read these things. You'll enjoy it. You'll learn it. Once you go into the system, you'll stop you reading fictions. You'll read pure philosophy and sensitive subjects that affect your daily life in terms of your parameters of good living. Next, please. These are finally these three slides. Autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. These are the principles which are generally recognized as the Western principles of bioethics. Some people may not agree. Some people may say that beneficence should come before autonomy, and I'm one of them, because I feel in the Eastern culture, beneficence comes before autonomy. But since we practice in the Western culture, autonomy, because that means everybody has a right to know everything. Sometimes that can harm the patient. But of course, everybody agrees that justice is the fundamental pillar of ethics. If you cannot do justice to your services, then you're not being a good human being. And if you're not being a good human being, you're an evil person. That you would not like to do under any circumstances. Next, please. The teaching strategies briefly, there should be a variety of teaching methods you can use. You can have a mix of large and small group discussions. You can have problem-based learning, didactic lectures, small talks. But the best way to teach is to develop clinical scenarios and watch them. And the technology is advancing so much that technagogy, the word that I picked up from Zafar Hassan, one of our colleagues, is telling us how to apply clinical sciences based on technology. Mubashir is an expert. He keeps telling me that technology is rapidly advancing. Next, please. So use technology, use all these new things like artificial intelligence, gamification, etc. So many things are coming up. So how do you achieve this? Should be introduced systematically and prepare students to meet the professionals at a very early stage in life. I would go at the level of A levels. You start teaching them ethics and philosophy and humanities and literature and art and poetry, because that is more useful than without any contradiction or in disrespect to zoology or botany. I feel it's better to learn these subjects in zoology and botany. It should be a feature of the whole medical curriculum. It should be introduced longitudinally right across the curriculum. It should be formally assessed, and just like any other subjects, it should be assessed like a proper subject per se. Next, please. So my conclusion is that medical ethics must form an integral part of medical care. Virtue ethics, in my view, should be encouraged because it is a built-in system. You do automatically a thing without thinking about it. You become used to it. You do a good thing. It gives you happiness, joy, and the word eudaimonia. Remember the word eudaimonia. That is what a health professional should look for. Heart's contentment, which is much more than happiness or joy or pleasure or anything you can. It gives you something that you can be answerable to God with a clear mind and a clear conscience. Next, please. This is the reference. I would strongly urge you to read this. A fantastic article that I read recently, Vaccination. It is published by somebody. It's a part of thesis, and I enjoyed thoroughly reading it. That it gives me an insight into the problem of vaccination. And thank you so much for listening to me. And do apologize for my blabbering talk. It was incoherent, but I tried to convey a message I think is close to my heart and should be useful for your practical lives. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'm welcome to answer.
Sir, it was a really very nice talk. But the question is, who will be the accountable in this pandemic when some people are thinking that this pandemic is just a war and we cannot stop the other pandemics which are favorable for us, sir? Who is the accountable in this thing?
Well, that's a very good question. That is what I raised the question. See, ideally, the civic society should raise this question. People who are learned, who scholars like yourself, for example, health professionals, they should raise the question at the highest possible levels. Like you can raise the level of governments, health authorities, the level of WHO. I mean, remember that particular gentleman, I would not like to name, who said that you can detoxify yourself by using a detox. I mean, that was a statement that was given to a famous man who was holding a powerful position. So that is unfortunately the whole story. See, a lot of mess up of COVID was caused by false propaganda, fake news, lack of trust. So who is answerable? It is the authorities who are answerable. And who should ask? Civic society should ask this question.
Anyone else? Please unmute yourself and you can ask the question. Sir, if I may ask.
Yes.
So, are moral judgments based on reason or emotions, sir?
Oh, fantastic question. This is exactly the philosophy that I was reading only yesterday. You see, reason is more important than emotions. And again, I'll go back to original philosophers. Aristotle, Plato, in fact, he started their reasoning. See, you're born with a certain reason. You're born for a certain reason. Plato expanded it. He said, you're born with a priori knowledge. Even a blind person doesn't know what a blue color is, but he has a perception. That is called priori knowledge. And that priori knowledge is basically based on goodness of nature. And that goodness of nature is built into your system, which you cultivate over time. So that is what gives you a reasoning. You look for a good cause, a good reason to do good to mankind. Emotions come into play as you grow up slightly and you start thinking, for example, for yourself, the selfish motives, pleasure motives, motives for gains in terms of financial or position or whatever. So what is important is that from my point of view, reasoning is important than emotions. Emotivism is a very important subject of philosophy, and they should read, which is the work that's done by David Hume. Reasoning is done by most of the work by Plato and Aristotle, and particularly the work that was done by Kant, Immanuel Kant. And in terms of Eastern philosophers, I would strongly urge you to read Mullah Sadra, a great philosopher of Iran in the 15th, who was contemporary of St. Thomas Aquinas and Descartes. And Mullah Sadra gives very clear concept that reasoning is the fundamental. It gives you the moral reasons, the moral obligations, reasons, obligations. Obligations, you see, you should have a balance between obligations and rights. If you have a right, you also have an obligation. The reasoning tells you what are your rights and what are your obligations. Emotivism, and if you are emotion-based, then you might take hasty decision. Yes, some people will argue that emotions are valuable. And there's a famous Iqbal's शेर, उसका मफहूम उर्दू में ही कहना पड़ेगा, उसका तर्जुमा तो नहीं कर सकते। बेखतर कूद पड़ा आतिश नमरूद में इश्क, अक्ल थी महवे तमाशाए लबे बामुगी. That is the importance of emotism. Ishq is something that's ultimate. So if you have that ishq, God's love or love, whatever, you can take an action. So emotivism you cannot condemn. It is there, it exists. But from my point of view, reasoning, I think, is more important.
Thank you, sir.
So there is Parth Ray. Can you unmute yourself and ask a question? I think.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Muhammad Asif, please go ahead.
Sir, the imperialistic emotions and terrors at one side and ethics is at the other end. Who is the winner?
Say it again. Can you repeat this?
Imperialistic attitudes at the one side and the ethics at the other side. Who is the winner?
Well, it's always ethics that wins. Imperialism is condemned by all. Nobody will approach, nobody will applaud imperialism. Imperialism is it's always been condemned. I mean, throughout life, you look at the history of mankind, imperialism has always been at the receiving end. Remember, when the imperialists, when the powerful people come and do things that they want to do, there are reactionaries and there are reformers. The reformers will perish in the hands of reactionaries. They will die momentarily to live forever, because there they will etch out their marks on the sandstone of time, which nobody can remove. But imperialists will try to destroy them. That is what the history of mankind is. Imperialists have always tried to destroy the reformers. The reformers live on. Temporarily they die, but they live forever. So nobody can applaud imperialism. That is to be condemned. Ethicists, moralists, people who are reformers in society, they always win. They might lose initially, but they eventually win.
If I may ask, sir, what is the nature of moral facts, or maybe the properties of the moral facts?
I don't get the full question. What is the impact?
Nature of moral facts, like basis of it.
Well, I mean, basically, it's like goodness. You want to something more. Morality is the whole objective of morality. The objective is to do goodness for mankind, and it's not mankind. See, animal welfare is an important factor. Anything, if you have the authority, you want to do goodness for anything that is within your control. To goodness with a view to do justice, and you base your decision on justice with a view to gain happiness. And like I said, go back to that word eudaimonia. Remember the word eudaimonia. You learn from practical experience called phronesis, and phronesis tells you how to use a certain experiment in the future based on your hindsight, based on previous experiences, so that you do not commit mistakes. And the moral of the whole issue is that what we learned as lessons during the pandemic, we should not repeat those mistakes in the forthcoming pandemic. Pandemics will happen again. The world is full of history of pandemics, but we should learn from mistakes, and the moral judgment should be based on doing goodness to your brethren and sisters.
Thank you, sir.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It touched my heart. Now, the point is, we who have trained as doctors some 30, 35 years ago, and have been practicing medicine for the last, 3 decades plus, we have a conflict, because none of what you are saying now was either thought about widely or thought to in our generation. And now, post-COVID, certainly this is becoming the major discourse. Now, I see conflicts in 2 situations. One, the healthcare modeling that we see in the Western world, as well as in the African and Eastern countries, is very much built on these gatekeepers principles, the commercial mode. Medicine has become a business. It's not anybody's fault, but that's how the world has driven medicine, the practice of medicine. That's one. And secondly, humanities and science divisions takes place still at a very early age, year 10, year 12 max. After that, one goes into humanities and one becomes science, physics, medicine, botany, and all the rest, or space science or whatever. So only recently we are reliving or rediscovering the value and the importance of humanities subjects as a core humanitarian human development perspective than just antibiotics or technologies, or whether you can go to the smallest artery in the brain and all the rest of it. So 2 things. I really your talk to be translated into daily practice. We perhaps have missed the boat because we're too old, but we can still learn. But certainly the next generation should benefit. How do you propose to translate this apart from curriculumizing it? Many things have been curriculumized, like communication skills, but on the real, the playing fields, I still don't see good communication between doctors and patients. They were better before. I think it's a question of lack of knowledge. The doctors of our generations took it upon themselves to be very knowledgeable first, and then they were able to confidently face the population. And these days, doctors know so little, or they're technologically advanced, but they carry less bytes of information and even lesser bytes to be able to communicate that in plain language to the patient. So quite a dilemma you have created in my brain. Sorry, it's a long question, comments, but I'd like your feedback on the issues I've raised, please. Thank you.
So may I ask you, what is your background? Where do you, which country calling from?
Well, okay, I'm Indian, but I happen to be practicing in the West. I shan't identify the country for 30 plus years.
Right.
And I wish to go back and, be to the country that I was born in, because that's more biologically relevant as well as psychologically relevant to the practice of medicine. And that's very important.
The reason I asked is, the reason I asked that question was because I can relate exactly to what your feelings are. Exactly this, that there was a time when I was a student, and for a long, long time when I'd been a teacher, nobody told us what ethics was. Nobody even mentioned the word ethics. I started learning ethics when I was already a professor of ENT in a famous college in Karachi. And I was invited to give a talk on normative principles of ethics in Iran. I had no idea what it was all about. So I started reading. So I came to England. I used to come regularly in those days for academic reasons, etc. I went to a center, in a field center, and I talked to people, and they said nobody knew in 1985 all these principles that I'm mentioning. Nobody knew. So we started reading. We developed a group of people with like-minded feeling that we should learn. We started. So what I'm saying is that ethics was never taught. What is happening now is that medical ethics is a part and parcel of medical curricula. In the UK, it has become mandatory. In other countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, in European countries, Australia, it is becoming a part of it. And the reason is exactly what you said. There was a time when doctor knew it all. And paternalistic approach was good enough, that because the patient would come say, well, the doctor knows everything, you decide whatever is good. But now it's not possible. Technology expands. The patient comes with all the knowledge in his hand. He's got a mobile phone, which has got Mr. Google, who's telling everything there about tinnitus management or cancer management, or whatever. So he's full of knowledge. He questions the doctor, and doctor cannot keep abreast of the knowledge that is developing so fast. So that gap that developed between the paternalistic approach and what is the modern approach, which is the patient has a right to ask questions, autonomy. That is where we had to fill in the gaps by using the platforms like this, Sadiq International Virtual University, or global platforms where we can teach, or basically medical schools. The question you mentioned about the topic about humanities and things, many, many years ago, I fought with higher authorities in Pakistan way back in the 1980s that we should, yes, give respect to zoology and botany, whatever you want to, but you must include humanities as a part of your subject at the higher school level. Because if you're training or you're teaching or you're developing professionals to treat patients or animals, whatever, they should learn about things, sensitivity, activity in dealing with human beings, for example, and I'm talking basically about medical doctors, not veterinary doctors, talk about people who, they should know the good and the bad and the feeling of emotions and pathos and et cetera, et cetera. I was laughed at. I still maintain, instead of teaching with no disrespect to them, instead of teaching zoology and botany, they should be teaching genetics, molecular biology and medical ethics, if not medical ethics, general humanities. In the USA, they have a 4-year program called liberal arts. I'm sure you're familiar with it. I approve of it because that's a fundamental. It trains a young mind to become a good doctor. You go through the whole learning process of reading philosophy and literature and poetry and then you become. in Pakistan, India, at the age of 21, 22, one becomes a doctor. Now, doctor means Hakim. Is he Hakim in practical? No, he's just rote memorize. I remember when I first came to England, I brought Gray's Anatomy on my right shoulder. I went to see Professor Laws, who said, well, this is a book only meant for the libraries. Why are you carrying it? I said, we were meant to teach, we were meant to learn from that book. So there's been a lot of misinformation. What is good, what's happening? And I must say that we're fortunate to be living in this modern era that things have changed drastically. Medical education has become a subject in its own right. And within medical education, medical ethics become a fundamental pillar. Remember, medical education is triangle: knowledge, skills, and attitude. The word attitude is ethics. Knowledge, you talk a lot. You have plenty of, if you have a lot of knowledge, you become a nerd without having skills. If you have skills and no knowledge, then you become a technician. You must have a balance. And that balance of knowledge and skill must be based on the fulcrum of ethics. Ethics means moral values, the principles, living good, doing good, achieving eudaimonia, and that factor of happiness. Thank you.
Sir, without taking further time, I think it is time to end the session.
Professor Zaidi?
Yep. Who's that?
Professor Zaidi, do you think that we should change the Hippocratic Oath and add,
It has
ethics
already.
to this?
No, it has already changed. Hippocratic Oath has
Yeah.
been modified. See, Hippocratic Oath was mighty good. Even before that, there was an oath called Babylonian Code that was developed by Hammurabi, famous from the times of Nebuchadnezzar, after the Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylonian history. The Hippocratic Oath has been modified. It has been modified by several people. Now they have different parts of it. The fundamental principle is the same, but you have modified different things depending on the circumstances. And I think it's a good point, because the fundamental principle is you want to do good. Fundamental rule of ethics is very simple. In medical terminology, do good, avoid evil. Do good, avoid evil. That's the fundamental thing. Whether you use Hippocratic Oath or Islamic Oath or Christian Oath or Jewish Oath, that is up to you. But Hippocratic Oath was the founding brick in the process of medical profession, and we must respect it.
This leads to the question that if you believe that everything is created on khair, goodness,
That is my belief.
attribute anything you do, it should be good. And, you spoke very eloquently about goodness and how to practice goodness and the principles of sort of evaluating goodness. But sadly, in the profession, I agree with Dr. Ray's very important questions he raised. We have passed that time when we were taught all this. Now we see people, far away from ethics. For example, somebody must have seen a program some years ago when statins were introduced and doctors were writing to anybody with headache, statins.
Yes, yes.
That morality is completely gone from the profession. And I think we need this subject, although we have introduced it in St. George's. We are teaching, ethics in the first clinical, curriculum. But it should be introduced even at sort of high school and intermediate level, that you should be a good person rather than any mischievous, individual.
Exactly the point that I made. Already, as you know, St. George's, for example, I know St. George's, my grandson is studying there, and he comes and discusses with me these ethical questions. At the A levels, he took philosophy as a subject in one of the schools, local schools in London. A lot of people, like myself, they're encouraging their children and grandchildren to take up ethics or philosophy or humanities at the higher level, at the high school level, at the A levels, instead of other subjects like geography or whatever. I mean, no disrespect to them, all valuable subjects. The point I'm making is that we should start learning. Now, the question that you've raised is very, very practical. Yes, what is happening is that medical profession has become greedy. It has always been greedy. It has been greedy throughout life. If you look at the human history, it has been one of the greediest professions. But greedy, it has been greedy. It has been bribed forever. Haven't you heard the story of this, what's called the sick patient syndrome? which is called sick text syndrome. Pharmaceutical companies will hire me and you to give a lecture somewhere, promote their drug, and that amount they spend, that is now transferred to the patient, because eventually it has to be transferred to the patient. That is called sick text. You and I are working in the good faith that we're promoting knowledge, going to a lecture here and a lecture there or a conference there. But no, that is the money that is being transferred by the pharmaceuticals or the appliance manufacturers for to the patients, transferred. So yes, this is a major problem. That is the reason why we have to have these conferences, these symposia, these webinars and discussions, open mind discussions. And like you said, khair, yes, everything is dependent on khair. That is my belief. You're born to be good. We become evil either because of inherent reasons that are there, faulty in the system of development. You see, nature is good. Nurture may be bad. That is the whole thing. So nature and nurture combined together, they result in the final outcome.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
That was great.
Can I ask a question about the ethics of dying?
Oh, it's a
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you're welcome. You're welcome. It's a very, very fascinating subject.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. So often as doctors, and particularly my elderly care and GP colleagues, are often confronted with a situation where you have a frail, physically frail older patient, maybe with dementia, stops eating, drinking, dehydrated, gets admitted, gets IV fluids, discharged again, and then the whole cycle kind of repeats itself. So often we are then confronted with the difficult question and also the difficult conversation. Do you continue that cycle of admission, discharge, readmission, or do you let the patient die with dignity in their own home, care home, keeping them comfortable? And where do you draw the line in that? I mean, it reflects on the kind of earlier slides that you showed about rationing ventilators, for example, which is another example for that. Yeah.
So what's your opinion?
I mean, I have several times gone through the scenario, and I found that the essential thing is talking to, if the patient is able to talk and make a decision, taking the patient into account, and also the family and the carers. So often it's patients in care homes, and the carers are often quite sensible with that. Sometimes you have to kind of have serious discussions with the family, with the, particularly if the children are not present. So if the patient lives in Dunstable where I work and the children are somewhere abroad or far away, and there's this guilt complex as well, yeah, for children.
So the first thing is communication. You have to discuss. In the Western society, you have to involve the patient because that's autonomy, right? In the Eastern culture, autonomy will not prevail. You probably beneficiaries, you want to benefit. So the patient's relatives may come in. They said, don't give the bad news to my relative because he might collapse. So you have your within rights with the consent of the patient to talk to the relatives. So you explain the situation. And not just the factors, the financial factors, because I know in Pakistan, I was approached once that somebody said, I'm happy to sell my house to treat my mother. I said, don't be ridiculous. Life is a gift of God, but death by itself is also a gift of God. And there is a saying from Imam Ali, who was a philosopher, soldier of Islam, said, death is a natural guard of life. It is the fortress of life. When it breaks, it just breaks. So sometimes death is a blessing. So you cannot avoid. So this is a question. This is a philosophy comes in, that we have to differentiate between palliative care and terminal care. Palliation, the patient will come back to life and maybe return to normal, not normal, but near normal. Terminal is terminal. In a terminal case, we have concepts which are guidelines, that the NHS guidelines are very clear what you should do. And if it's a palliation, that is where you have to discuss with the family that, look, we've done it 3 times or 5 times. How long do you want to carry on? So the question will be that next time he develops a pneumonia, a 95-year-old person with extensive pneumonia, etc., don't treat aggressively. DNR and DNA are important. They are valuable, but they're only documents. In clinical sense, they're important, but in terms of philosophy, you have to convince the patient, the relative, that he may be suffering. I mean, would that patient want, that's the question, ask that patient, does he want to live in that miserable life? So you do not do what's called euthanasia, you do not assist dying, but sometimes you let the patient pass away quietly. Now that's debatable. I don't know, what's your approach?
I think my approach is, once I've discussed it with the patient and the patient does want to kind of, and most patients at this stage who can discuss, they want to go, they want to leave the world, and you have to respect that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your good, very excellent talk, and thanks for answering the question.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Well, Mubashir, that should end the session. We had a good session. Thank you so much. I'm grateful to all the participants and facilitators, particularly Dr. Bukhari and Dr. Mubashir. Thank you. And this recording will be available on the webpage of Sadiq International Virtual University. Thank you and goodbye.